Well, hello and welcome. Good morning to our webinar around the circular economy taxonomy study. We're very excited that many of you are joining us this morning. My name is Christine Lemaitre. I'm the CEO of the DGNB, the German Sustainable Building Council, and as well I'm the chair of the CPEA, the Climate Positive Europe Alliance. And I'm very happy to have the honor to welcome you all to our today's presentation around the circular economy taxonomy study, and hopefully give an answer to that big question: is the real estate industry ready for a circular economy? And if not, what could maybe be changed? So I'd like to hand over to Sima Issa and Ursula Hartenberger. Sima Issa is the project lead for that project. She's working at DGNB, and at that moment I really like to thank her already for all her hard work, and she will present to us the study. And then Ursula Hartenberger, who's the General Secretary of CPEA, will be the moderator for the rest of the webinar, and hopefully as well get your questions in. We have a small panel discussion around market voices, and then the option for a Q&A and a wrap-up, which will be done by Bruno Sauer, my colleague from the Spanish Green Building Council. And around 11:30 we'll conclude the webinar, and then we will as well distribute the study. And we're very happy and eager to get your feedback, your opinions, and hopefully we see that as a kickoff on how we can drive circular economy in the real estate sector with more dynamic, and as well give feedback to the European Commission. So Sima, I give over to you and for your presentation around the study results and the findings and recommendations from the study.
Thank you very much, Christine, for the warm welcome. It gives me very much pleasure to start this webinar with you today. It is no news that in our built environment, we consume around 1/3 of the global resources, and that the construction industry is also responsible for 1/3 of the global greenhouse gas emissions. Simultaneously, when looking at the investments, the FIEC statistical report states that around 80% of the investments within the construction goes into construction of buildings. So while the circular economy, the circularity gap report shows that when analyzing the state of circularity in the economy, to empower different stakeholders with findings to accelerate the transition towards more circularity, we can see that in the built environment in Europe, our built environment is only around at 8% circularity. And with this brief statistical overview, it is very clear that the European taxonomy, which aims at categorizing and defining economic activities as sustainable, has a huge lever to increase the transition towards more circular economy, as it addresses not only the building sector, but also obviously the financial sector at which it is actually addressed. And in this way, the taxonomy, when it was launched almost 3 years ago now, it had already defined the transition to circular economy as one of the 6 key environmental objectives, with the others being also climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, pollution, biodiversity, and also obviously the sustainable use of water. So with this back in mind, this was also the starting point of our study, actually, when nearly 1 year ago, the Sustainable Finance Platform launched multiple different reports on further developments at a regulatory level. I think we've all gotten used to the accelerated level of changes happening on regulation level. So for one, the Sustainable Finance Platform last year proposed a social taxonomy. Then there was also a report on the extension of the environmental taxonomy. So not only talking about classifying green activities, but also potentially brown activities. And then there were a lot of discussions on adding to the existing environmental taxonomy by proposing new screening criteria, as we already know it from the Climate Delegated Act. So from this report, from the last report on adding on to the existing environmental taxonomy, we can see that for the construction and real estate sector, new criteria have been defined for circular economy. And if you're already familiar with the existing taxonomy, with the Climate Delegated Act, you will know that so far in Annex 1 and Annex 2, criteria or technical screening criteria have been defined for climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. And now it is also, or this report was there to now continue the definition for the subsequent criteria. So for new construction and renovation, this report gave definitions for circular economy. So with this report in mind, 8 different organizations across Europe came together last year and initiated a study with the overarching objective to evaluate whether the market is actually ready for these screening criteria they proposed. And at the same time, we also wanted to prepare and help build up capacities within the financial market participants, but also help the project developers and existing building owners to understand what the criteria are, what the criteria actually mean, and what it would also mean in turn for their internal processes in order to embed more sustainability during their practices. We also wanted to examine the efforts and the advantages of implementing the criteria, and because they are only a proposal from the sustainable, or they are the proposal from the sustainable finance platform, we also wanted to derive recommendations for the European Commission, knowing that the European Commission will take this proposal to then define their own draft delegated act on circular economy. So if we talk about taxonomy-aligned economic activities, we just as a background information for you all, it is relevant to know that you always choose one of the 6 environmental objectives to substantially contribute to, while also keeping in mind that you also have to comply to all the other do no significant harm criteria for the other 5 environmental objectives, which you have not chosen for your substantial contribution. And you have to ensure that you're aligned to the social minimum safeguards. And the report, which was published by the Sustainable Finance Platform, was addressing mostly the substantial contribution for the 4th environmental objective of circular economy. So we can see where the report fits into the whole picture, and consequently, the scope of the study was also focused around the substantial contribution criteria. As an overview, so that you know what we were analyzing, you can see here which criteria they were actually proposing. I've put together a comparison between both the significant contribution criteria, which are basically the proposal of the Sustainable Finance Platform, next to the criteria for do no significant harm for circular economy, so that you know what is already existent on the right column, and in the left column what is actually the new proposal. So in order to significantly contribute to circular economy, the Sustainable Finance Platform first of all proposed to treat all generated waste according to the European Demolition and Construction Waste Protocol, but also they want on project level that at least 90% of the non-hazardous construction and demolition waste is prepared for reuse and recycling. Further, the criteria require a calculation of life cycle assessment for the entire building and a publication of these results. And they aim that new construction and renovation projects should support circularity by designing not only resource efficient buildings, but also adaptable and flexible and also dismantleable buildings. For renovation buildings, there is an extra criteria which says that 50% of the original building should be retained. And we have for new construction projects also a similar quota where it says that you need to, the building must comprise of at least 15% reused materials, 15% recycled materials and components, and 20% a combination of either reused, recycled, or responsibly sourced renewable materials. So this 6th requirement is actually a very high quota which defines that 50% of your building and materials have a certain requirement to fulfill. The 7th requirement is being aligned to REACH, and also that materials do not contain asbestos or other substances of very high concern. And we have the 8th requirement, which talks about using electronic tools to manage certain information on the materials and components which are used within the building. So in comparison to the do no significant harm criteria, you can see that the bar has been set higher, which makes sense because we're not doing no significant harm to circular economy, but we are significantly contributing towards towards the transition to circular economy. The study timeline looked as was as followed. We got the report in March last year, so in April and June we these 7 organizations got together and initiated the study. We launched a phase when we were acquiring market participants interested. In July and September, we had interviews with the market participants. We conducted trainings, and market participants started with the data collection on project level. In September until October, we were working on giving feedback towards the European Commission and also the Sustainable Finance Platform. And we were very lucky because we were able to have a virtual roundtable with experts from the Sustainable Finance Platform and also from the European Commission to share our insights we could gather with our market participants. And in October, November, the market participants then got feedback on their individual projects. And in November to February, we were analyzing the results. And now it's the final stage when we are launching our study today. We had a vast amount of different market participants. We had 29 market participants in total. And if we look at the consistency of the market participants, we can see we had we had a large amount of project developers, we had construction companies, consultancies, investors, banks, but also representatives from asset managers and corporate real estate as participating companies within the project. And we also we could also make use of insights and expertise of 16 different experts from these organizations, which were a part of our advisory board member. Within the interviews we conducted, we could figure out what the market sentiment was in regard to sustainability. So first of all, we compared the importance and relevance the market participants felt for the different environmental objectives. And you can see in the right graph that we have climate change mitigation, which was classed as most relevant, while the protection of biodiversity was classed as the second most relevant environmental objective, and climate change adaptation and also circular economy shared the 3rd place when ranking the relevance and the perceived importance of the EU taxonomy environmental objectives. At the same time, in the interviews, we could figure out what the market sentiment was towards circularity. So for one, circular economy always seemed to be a very integral part of the sustainability understanding within the companies. But at the same time, market participants said that the lack of methods and clear approaches for implementations always meant that it's more of a objective and still lacking in implementation. We could also figure out that financial stakeholders or financial parties who are more also strategically involved within the construction sector were more aiming towards understanding the market readiness, while the project developers wanted to gain know-how to understand how they can increase the circularity within their projects. All in all, however, there are a lot of challenges which the market perceives in implementing circularity. These can be clustered in 4 different aspects. So one is the lack of data availability and transparency, meaning that many market participants claimed that information is missing on the quality of available secondary sources. They also said basically that data is lacking to analyze and track circular performance of their projects, and it's difficult to gain access to information which is required to enable the closing of loops. Then as a second aspect, there is the lack of circular materials and products available. So in order to adhere to the quota set out within the taxonomy, you need to also you have to have access to the secondary materials, and it is difficult to identify which secondary circular materials are available at the certain point of time when it is needed within the project. Then a third aspect is the lack of know-how for implementation. So here it was said that it's difficult to understand which information is actually relevant for data collection. So to discern what are key methodologies and tools which can be applied poses a great challenge within projects to implement more circularity. And then there are also regulatory restrictions which can hinder circular thinking on project level. Now, continuing towards the case studies, we had altogether 35 new construction projects we were analyzing and 3 renovation projects. You can see they were all located across Europe, and also from the building type, we had a lot of residential buildings, we had a lot of office buildings, but also logistic buildings, laboratories, hotels, retail and mixed-use buildings. And another fact which has to be noted in this graph is that a lot of projects which we were looking at are going to be or were certified. So 95% of the projects are being actually certified, and only 5% are not. So that means that when looking at the results in a few slides, we will have to keep this in mind, because in the last taxonomy study we published 2 years ago now, we already saw that certified projects tend to perform much better in regards to taxonomy alignment than non-certified projects. In order to enable data collection, the study group made questionnaires, and we structured the questionnaires not only asking basic information on the building and the minimum requirements, but all the taxonomy criteria and also the data reliability, so to understand what kind of proof documentation is being used to document that the taxonomy criteria are actually being aligned to. Within the questionnaire, and the very focus of the study was the significant contribution to circular economy. However, because we were also giving back feedback to our market participants, we also requested information on the other do no significant harm criteria. As a study result, we have 3 deliverables. So one was the recommendation report for the European Commission and the Sustainable Finance Platform, which was also published in October last year, and it is also available on our website. Then the market participants also each received a confidential company-specific report giving details towards their particular project. And then we have obviously the study which we are launching today, which will give an overview of the entire project. The company-specific reports were structured as you can see on this slide. So it was an overview of the significant contribution criteria, but also the do no significant harm requirements on project level. So very similar, structured towards assessing the taxonomy alignment of the projects, which enabled the market participants to understand where there are where more documentation would be needed, or which requirement was not exactly fulfilled. Overarchingly, we have to say that none of the 35 projects in new construction and none of the 3 projects in renovation were fully aligned to the proposed criteria for significantly contributing to circular economy because of different aspects. You can see already in the graph on the right-hand side, this is a graph on new construction, on the new construction projects, and you can see that the majority of projects were only fulfilling around 25 to 50% of the taxonomy requirements, and only 4 projects were able to fulfill more than 75% of the requirements. This was due to different factors. So on the organizational level, this was mostly because data was lacking, circular economy focused data was lacking, and the performance of circular aspects within the project was not being monitored. So there are internal knowledge gaps we can see here, and also on a structural level we could see that, especially when the taxonomy criteria didn't define clear methods or definitions of certain words within the criteria, the market participants had a lot of difficulty in finding the right methods or definitions or tools in order to adhere to the requirements. Now, looking at this more specifically, we have, and going into the individual requirements I showed before, we can compare, for one, the do no significant harm criteria for circular economy, and also the significant contribution criteria, because for significantly contributing, you need to have 90% of waste being recycled or prepared for recycling, whereas for do no significant harm, you only have to have 70%. And you can see in this graph here that around 40% more projects could prove that they are recycling 70% of their waste, meaning that that more projects were able to comply to the do no significant harm requirement. Only 40% could prove on project level that they are recycling 90% of their waste. Then, because we had a lot of certified projects we were looking at, they were all very well prepared for the life cycle analysis requirements, because in most sustainable building certifications, life cycle assessment is a key methodology which is required to be implemented. So around 90% of the projects could fulfill this requirement. Then we have the requirement for circular design with focus on resource efficiency, adaptability, flexibility, and dismantleability. And these 3 different aspects were only provable for the market participants when clear methods were given. So this just shows that in order to have an implementable taxonomy, we need clear methodologies which can help in implementing and assuring alignment. We also saw that around 70% of the projects were using electronic tools to manage and store their information. However, often the information on maintenance or the recovery and potential reuse pathways was not part of the information which was being stored on the different materials and components being used. Further, we also have a further specific result which shows that which is aligned to the fact to the material quotas. So for material quotas, we had 15% quotas for reused materials, 15% for recycled materials, and 20% for either a combination of reused, recycled, and responsibly sourced renewable materials. And these quotas could be either calculated by weight or by surface, and within the study we saw that on most of the time the calculation method by weight was used, but you can see in this graph that most of the projects were not at all aligned to the 15% reuse quota or the recycled content quota, but more like 70% of the projects were not able to fulfill this requirement. We didn't see many country differences here when we were analyzing this, because in all countries the non-alignment was always higher than the data unavailability. And another point I would like to add here is that the renewable material quota was always the most likely to be fulfilled. Now, carrying on with the recommendations, we were able to derive from analyzing these different projects. We can see that we had key recommendations for the further development of the taxonomy. We saw that the circular economy taxonomy, as it has been proposed by the Sustainable Finance Platform, is very ambitious, and there are a lot of difficulties in implementing individual requirements. But on a broader scale, when we look at the circular economy taxonomy and also the climate taxonomy, which is already being applied to in the market, we see that there are very large differences in the ambition. So we see the need to push for a much more ambitious climate taxonomy to ensure also that the circular economy taxonomy is being applied, because we can see or we see the risk that otherwise only the climate criteria are being applied and circular economy taxonomy will not be applied at all. Additionally, we see the need to provide much more unambiguous methodologies or to refer to existing and tested methodologies, because especially when methodologies are unclear, the market stakeholders have difficulty to document compliance. Then it's also there are also discussions around deciding who has the authority to decide what is enough to be classed as taxonomy aligned. And the last point in recommendations for the taxonomy was that we need to ensure a much more level playing field between the renovation criteria and new construction criteria, because keeping in mind the bigger objectives in Europe also defined in the European renovation wave, for example, we can see that the technical screening criteria, as they are defined at the present moment, they clearly favor new construction projects instead of renovations, and we need to push for a higher renovation rate in Europe. We also derived recommendations for application, and these are all in reference to collecting more data and document more data on the building during the entire life cycle. So stakeholders along the supply chain within the building project have to take the responsibility within their area of influence by documenting and visualizing the relevant information on sustainability aspects and also on circular economy aspects. And there we see the building material passport as a key instrument to achieve this information documentation. And this is it from my point of view. Ursula, I'd like to hand over to you.
Yes, I mean, thank you very much, Sima. My name is Ursula Hartenberger. I'm the Secretary General of the Climate Positive Europe Alliance, CPEA, and I see that there are actually some questions that we may want to have a look at either now, Sima, before we go into the panel discussion, or whether we want to park them for the moment and then come back to them later. I mean, there are three questions that are, you know, a bit more technical. I think there's one from Timo Markets, which I already attempted to respond to. I'm not a clairvoyant, but I think it is safe to say that the values, the thresholds over time will probably have to become stricter, because the taxonomy is a dynamic tool. It has been designed to be a dynamic tool to also evolve alongside whatever legislation on specific environment, on this specific environmental objective is going to be developed. So while these changes are not going to happen next year, yeah, but it's safe to say that over time it is one can expect changes and further tightening. Then we have a question from Konstantin Franz, and the question here is: does the taxonomy specify whether it is to be calculated by weight or surface?
Yeah, it just says you can calculate it by weight or surface, and then you have to specify how you calculated the quotas. But we obviously saw in the study as well, so you might want to check the report for that, that there are difficulties in determining the clear methodology for calculating the surface quota, and then obviously there are discussions of adding extra materials which are not really needed just to achieve the 20% renewable quota. So I think there is a lot of work which needs to be done in order to look at how these quotas can be calculated. So the taxonomy at the present moment offers the option of either by weight or surface calculation.
Yeah, thank you, Sima. And then we have a question from Agna Markets. In fact, there are two questions from Agna. The first one is it's about the do no significant harm criteria for climate mitigation. And there is a mention of measures that have to be taken to reduce noise, dust, and pollutant emissions during construction or maintenance works, but there's no further clarification of which measures should be applied or how they should be measured and reported. And then maybe we can look at her second questions, whether there's any channel, email contact, or clear doubts related to the application of the taxonomy criteria.
I think on European level there is not any channel or email contact as far as I know of. Obviously there are different experts in the market, so you might want to reach out to your local Green Building Council, because especially when it comes to applying the taxonomy criteria within the different European countries, I think we have through our work on studies, etc., we have a few experts on the subject, so you might want to reach out there. And in terms of the other question you had on measures to or documentation methods for to show that you're taking measures to reduce the noise, dust, and pollutant emissions, you also might want to check the report, because we have added the questionnaires within the report, and there are hints given how you can document the different requirements.
Yeah, and then one last question is, it's about specific materials. Are there any quotas for materials such as glass, metal, wood, or concrete, or is it all like more generic?
It's more generic.
Yeah. So no specific targets and quotas for specific materials. Thank you very much for taking these questions, Sima, and thank you for the presentation. And we will now go straight into the panel discussion, and I'm very happy to be joined by my esteemed panelists. We've got three panelists, two from the Netherlands and one from Denmark. So I'd like to welcome Anja Köhler, Jonathan Leonardsen, and Rosa Weekamp. We will be having informal panel discussions, which you're very welcome to join later with questions to the panelists or questions to me or thoughts and views, and so don't feel shy about putting your questions in the chat. So first of all, I'd like to introduce my panelists. So we have Anja Köhler, who's the Sustainability Innovation Manager at EDGE in the Netherlands, where she is responsible for the company's sustainability and ESG strategy. Anja works across all operating countries, and she's frequently communicating with colleagues to ensure that the company's sustainability and ESG goals are well embedded in all projects, which is greatly helped by Anna's architecture background, which has proved a real asset in understanding the more technical and practical implication of EDGE's development projects. And then we have Jonathan. Jonathan is head of sustainability and ESG at Balder in Denmark. He's a trained economist with 10 years experience working with sustainability within real estate. Previously, he worked as a management consultant and has a DGNB certification in new buildings in Denmark. And then last but not least, there's Rosa. Rosa is a regulatory expert within ABN AMRO, also in the Netherlands, where she focuses on sustainable finance regulation. And here in particular, her expertise lies with the EU taxonomy. And she works with both internal and external stakeholders on the interpretation and application of this taxonomy to stay up to date with developments and market practice around this particular regulation. So Rosa brings to the discussion a very broad perspective of a financial institution on the challenges around the EU taxonomy and how it may actually impact the financial market. So, first of all, I'd like to kick off with a couple of general questions because all your organizations participated in the study. So I'd like to ask you, what motivated you to participate in this specific circular economy taxonomy readiness, market readiness study? Rosa, can I start with you?
Yes, of course. I think every member was very interested in participating in this study to really discover more about the market readiness. I think as a financial institutions, we have a lot of conversations with our client, and we would really like to share this knowledge with our clients. And I think in addition, if you specifically look at the circular economy, you see that we're really still challenging around the measurability of the circular economy. So we would be really interested to see within the study how the taxonomy will really help us in identifying a bit more of a standardized measure in terms of the circular economy.
Thanks. Jonathan, what made your organization join the study? Did you have to do a lot of selling, or was it, easily accepted that this is something that
Well, participating in the study was not a hard sell, but for us it was relevant to understand what's going to happen with the EU taxonomy. It's the new standard within green investments. It's the framework that we have to live up to if we want to sell products to the investment market that are to be a part of a green portfolio. So for us, it was very relevant to be a part of this and to be at the forefront of understanding what are the requirements, how they're developing, and even if this is a process where we are also providing feedback and then the requirements will change. I mean, we saw that from the first study that was also done in this setup on mitigation. Understanding and knowing in which direction are we moving. I mean, because even if these are not the actual requirements that will be published, it's most likely this way and towards these benchmarks and levels that we are moving. And as a business, we need to know where's the market requirements moving.
So it was as much as wanting to be on the forefront, but also to have a deeper understanding of what is actually written on the wall for the future.
Yes, and it's also it's both sort of a risk mitigation point of view. What type of iceberg are we steering towards? How can we navigate around it? But then not just sort of by getting this knowledge and by participating, it enables us to, when we start new projects, to already now start asking ourselves, well, how can we work with this? And even if we can't align with the requirements, well, how can we start reporting on them, or how can we start build up an understanding that we need to work in this way? So it becomes a business development point of view rather than a reactionary point of view.
And was this proactive element also something that motivated Edge to participate in the study?
Yes, I think we, as a developer, we have very, very similar perspective to Jonathan. So there was for sure this risk mitigation aspect, because we're seeing now a lot of investors and banks who buy projects from us. They ask for an EU taxonomy-aligned building from us without even knowing what that actually means. Also often not knowing that the EU taxonomy is evolving still. So I think this is a fixed thing that they can now purchase from us, and the criteria won't change anymore. That understanding what comes there in the future, that was one thing for sure. And the other one was also really prototyping, like business readiness, testing on the criteria which are likely to be implemented in this way or a similar way, testing where we stand today. So really testing 2 of our projects, one in the Netherlands, one in Germany, as a prototype.
Yeah, so what was your experience? Some of you have already participated in the climate change mitigation taxonomy study, and was this different? What was it a smooth ride, or were there some challenges? Who wants to take this?
Well, I can go first. We didn't participate in the first study. We did read up on it beforehand, and also started to look into the mitigation criteria. We found the criteria for the circular economy to be quite hard to achieve. Some of them were also there's also a challenge when it comes to wording and definitions of how do you separate reuse, recycled, upcycle, etc. from each other. And one of the things that we also had an internal discussion on when going through the criteria was, this is really something you need to have in the beginning of the project. I mean, you can't halfway through, or even, I would even say 10% through your planning process, start to sort of say, okay, well, let's adopt these requirements, because a lot of it starts even when you're purchasing the land. You need to understand how are we going to handle the built material, all the sort of all the buildings, all the material that already is on the plot. How do we make sure that 90% of it is, you know, put to reuse and not just put towards incineration, which is something that is happening a lot in Denmark with our waste to power energy system. So there are a lot of requirements that you need to have a full understanding of even before you start your project. And I think that was one of the main challenges for us. Is we were, of course, applying a project that we were already in the midst of developing, so it didn't live up to a lot of the requirements at all. That was a learning experience, and it was interesting for us, but it was it also showed this is it's a tough level that they're aiming for here.
Right, so high levels of ambition. That's the verdict from Jonathan. Would you agree with this, Anja and Rosa?
Yes and no. I think for us the major part was that the circular design principles and the circular economy includes a lot of stakeholders. So on the climate mitigation, climate adaptation part, we can do a lot as a developer ourselves. It's about figuring out the right KPIs and then steering upon them throughout the process. So yes, that includes, of course, the other stakeholders as well, so the design team, but also the contractor. But with the circular economy aspects and KPIs, it's even more so that we have to rely on, for instance, the contractor and the architectural offices that we work with, and that they are aware of this and what it means. Like Jonathan said, you need to change the way you approach your development and redevelopment from the beginning on, and also have the right skills there with the design team and with the contractor. And things as recycling rates for construction waste, that is really something that requires the know-how and capacity of contractors. And of course, we can steer that to some extent, but not fully. And we often see that contractors, at least in the Netherlands and Germany, are not the most front-running companies, and often also not part of those discussions that we're having here. And so that for us is like a supply chain risk. So from investors, there comes this wish to have a new taxonomy-aligned building, but then we need to lie this down with the contractor, who then maybe not aware or is not fully skilled or capable, or there are any other obstacles in the supply chain. So that we're really seeing the stakeholder reliance that we see as a big component.
Yeah,
Yeah, so
I very much agree with Anja. I think if you look at it, I'm sorry?
Go ahead, Rosa.
Okay, yeah, I very much agree with the points that Anja just mentioned. And I think specifically from a bank perspective, I think you can see that we are very much dependent on our clients to actually provide us this data. And I think if you make the comparison between circular economy and the climate change mitigation objective, you see that actually the climate change mitigation objective is much further advanced already, not only by being implemented first, but also in terms of the standards and the way of measuring out there are a lot more advanced. So also the data that would be available for the market to actually confirm that it's taxonomy aligned, it's much more advanced within the climate change mitigation field. So I think it was also mentioned in the presentation by Seema before that this actually might pose as a risk that the focus within the EU taxonomy will be much more on climate change mitigation and might actually overshadow those of the circular economy, because they are much more difficult to quantify and to testify and to really prove. So that is also what we're seeing within our clients, that they're already struggling within the climate change mitigation, and that is even more so applicable for the circular economy part. So I think that is also a challenge that we recognize as a bank.
Yeah, so I've heard now from you that there are some challenges in relation to skills down the supplier chain. There are also some challenges in relation to data, and I recall having spoken to you before, Jonathan, that you also mentioned that in practical terms, there are also some challenges with regard to predictability of availability of materials. Can you maybe elaborate that a little bit more?
Yes. Often when we are when the EU taxonomy is a very interesting instrument. We are making buildings that are focusing on the on an institutional investor market. So it's often quite large buildings or projects, and when we are to use upcycled or reused materials, the supply chain and the process of constructing the building is quite long. I mean, from the design phase to you actually have a finished building or project, 4 or 5 years is not uncommon. And it's easy in the beginning of the design phase, when you're buying the land, when you're looking at sketches with your architects and engineers, to sort of say, okay, well, we can use recycled materials, and it doesn't necessarily have to be all the same. Let's say we're using bricks for the climate shell. It doesn't. All the bricks don't have to have the same red shade. There can be some differences, and there'd be a variety. It can even have an interesting architectural expression. But we also, in terms of making an investment financially in building this product, need to have some sort of predictability in, okay, when we are then constructing, do we have the materials ready? Where are we going to get them from? Is it going to be the right quantity? Is it going to be the right quality that we're able to get when we need it? And there are some very interesting projects ongoing in Denmark, for instance, when they're sort of mapping the built environment and trying to map and see where can you get materials from in order to increase the circular economy. But if there's a building that's supposed to be teared down and we would like to use the bricks from that building, and then all of a sudden we decide to put our project on hold, or the municipality comes and say, oh no, you need to wait a year, or a million other things that always happens and always delays these projects. Well, are the people who wanted to tear down the building because we wanted to buy the bricks, what are they going to do? There's a supply chain problematic that isn't really solved yet, and that hasn't really been hasn't really been handled yet, and it's classic chicken or the egg type of problem. What comes first, the massive supply chain or the demand? And we're just one actor or participant in the market saying, well, we would like, of course, to have a perfect supply chain, but I very much understand if the people who are selling recycled bricks or upcycled bricks and so on don't see it in the same way. So there's there's some market mechanisms that sort of speaks against the maturity and the possibility for us to live up to some of these requirements.
So how could these challenges be addressed? Because we, heard skills issues, awareness issues, maybe also an issue of understanding on the part of a contractor, but maybe also on the part of the client. That's what I took from you, Rosa. So, but maybe also, us as end consumers, we want a perfect, if we build something, we want a perfect building, and it may not be quite as perfect as we think it might be, because if we have like not all the same color, the bricks in the same color. So what do you think needs to really change to make the taxonomy, the circular economy a reality within the sector, and that everything goes smoothly? I mean, we're thinking ahead, of course. These things are obviously not in place yet. So who wants to react to that?
Yeah, I could give my perspective. I think if you look at how the taxonomy is applied in general, but also the issues that Jonathan just described very, very well, is I think that we need a lot of market collaboration to really kind of get these challenges together, because I think what you see is that not one stakeholder is able to solve or address these challenges, but you actually need every participant. And I think the more you communicate with each other and the more you're transparent about the challenges and the more you share knowledge, then the easier it will become to address them. And I think it's not only about the technical challenges, but also about the financial challenges. What kind of business models require these new development? How does this impact financing? There is a lot of different aspects. But also, how do you need the government? Like, what kind of data should be available in the market? Where should this data become available? Do we need public databases? I think there is just a lot of different moving parts that we kind of need to put together. So this is also why I think that these kind of roundtables or panels are really interesting, because it brings together different market participants and really also allows us to better understand the other side of the table and the different elements that we have to put together to kind of get the full picture. So I think those elements are really important.
I think for us, not only to criticize the complexity of the proposed criteria, but also highlight what is actually quite nice about them is the fact that you do have two different levels. Because I feel like often when it's about complex topics such as life cycle assessments or circular economy, those of us who are the front runners tend to highlight the complexity a lot and maybe demotivate the parties who are just beginning with it. And I think that mechanism of the EU taxonomy to basically have two levels that do not significant harm level as the must-haves for the easier ones, and then the substantial contribution as the harder ones. I think that itself is actually quite nice, because it shows that there are three very key things you should do in any case, and then if you want to excel and if you have the knowledge, the skills, the right partners in your specific project, you can go beyond that. So I think that actually is quite nice to really focus on must-dos and the easy wins and the starter set, so to speak. So I think that is something we need to highlight much more on all different kinds of topics, but especially in the circular economy. So also for those who are just beginning with it, like what to do next in your next project. But then what I'm personally seeing as well, that for us the topic of the embodied carbon emissions of projects, so the emissions coming from the materials, the production of the materials, that is really picking up. So for a long time we've only focused on the operational carbon emissions from the energy consumption, and we also see that being reflected in the EU taxonomy so far, with clear targets on the operational side, but not necessarily on the embodied carbon side. But some markets are running further than that. For instance, in France, where you have an embodied carbon target to receive your building permit, and there we're seeing a very interesting dynamic between the embodied carbon target and the circular economy, because the moment you use recycled materials which already had a second life, or you use materials which can be recycled at the end, your embodied carbon of the building will be lower, of course, because less carbon, less energy was used to produce those materials. So that we're also really seeing at the moment as a useful mechanism that we can really use to steer. And then next to that, we have those, let's say, still evolving circularity scores of percentage of recycled materials and what is upcycled, what is recycled, all of that. So that is really next to it as a secondary goal. But at the moment, we're really seeing that steering on the embodied carbon emissions of the whole life cycle can really help to boost the use of circular materials.
Yeah, I think it's a win-win, isn't it? And also by applying both embodied carbon strategies and circular economy, hopefully that will also alleviate the lack of data. But of course, it means that you have to have some kind of data repository where all this data can be gathered, because in the past a lot of data has been collected, but then it's just not been coherently and systematically managed. So that is, I think, something that goes across all of the environmental objectives, and of course also the social aspects. If we don't have data, we cannot take any informed decisions. But I'd like also, I mean, one of the objectives of the taxonomy was obviously to stimulate, to trigger innovation in environmental friendly technologies, products, processes, and so forth. Do you think that the criteria as they stand are going to do that, or are you a bit skeptical about this? How's that?
Yeah, I think that is a little bit difficult around the EU taxonomy. I think if you look at the taxonomy in general, I think there is a bit of a trade-off between kind of setting really strict requirements and by their creating a level playing field across Europe. Also, on the other hand, I think they also try to remain open for market practice and innovation. And I think the stricter you are on the requirements, the less room there is for openness, innovation, and development. So I think there is a little bit of a trade-off there. And I think what might be the risk within the EU taxonomy is that if you focus too specifically on creating those alignment with those criteria, it's really going to create a tunnel vision towards that was what's specified. Well, I think innovation should also really stimulate innovation outside of these criteria. So I think in that respect, it's really important also that the European Commission stays really close in contact with the market and to really have this open dialogue about, okay, what is really market practice, what is in development, and what can we see in terms of development for the criteria. Because I think, Ursula, you also said it at the beginning, that the taxonomy is really a dynamic tool. I don't think it's meant to be static. And I think innovation is also very much a dynamic instrument. So it's really something that's moving over time. So I think in order for the taxonomy to be a success, I think we should really allow for this market development and really for these dynamics to be implemented in the taxonomy. Otherwise, I'm afraid that it won't have the desired effect indeed.
Any views on this from the other panelists?
So what we're seeing is that at the moment, the EU taxonomy, the awareness of the EU taxonomy lives a lot in the banks, the financing sector. It trickles down to us as project developers, those who are delivering those projects to the end investors. But I don't see yet a lot of smaller supply chain companies thinking a lot about the EU taxonomy. They do think, of course, a lot about sustainability, but then really coming from an ideological perspective. So they're the great companies who are working already with who can recycle bricks and make new bricks out of them, who can recycle other types of products. In the Netherlands, there is a new plant which can take concrete apart again into its individual pieces, actually, and then use the sand, the cement, the grit, and mix it again. So there are great companies, but they often don't look at it from a EU taxonomy perspective. So they look from we want to change the world perspective often, which you can argue is the better perspective than trying to lose yourself in details of regulation. And I think at the moment this needs to come together. So the over-regulation that we are in Europe and the European Union really likes, I mean, we are super bureaucratic, that needs to come together with startups who actually do want to make the world a better place and who have really good ideas and who just need the financing. and need pilot projects to test the products. And that at the moment they're like, we see that we speak two different languages. We speak the language of the investors and the banks, and we speak the language that we speak on construction side. And yeah, that's two worlds at the moment.
But wasn't the taxonomy designed to address that, to create a common language that would relate to both of the demand side and this supply side? So
technically, yes, but
you're not quite convinced, Anya. Not yet.
Technically, yes, but if you, I mean, I sometimes get lost in the criteria and trying to map them and what applies when and what is the do not significant harm criteria, what is a so I already need an Excel sheet to map all of this for myself. And I think if we make it too complex, then we use that momentum that could have been created, because the smaller startups, they won't have the capacity to dive into e-taxonomy and keep on mapping the changes and keep up to date and potentially attend those webinars. They really need key criteria they can steer on, and that they know that if you steer on this criteria, that product will be asked a lot in the market because there is a great demand. It's clear that green products in whatever industry we're talking about will be scarce because the demand will be bigger than the supply. But I feel like we're just making it so complex that I said in the beginning that a lot of companies just shy away because they don't see it, they don't see the trees anymore in the forest.
But I think it's it's also a matter of predictability. I mean, where are we moving with this? The fact that the taxonomy is not a static, but is a fluent and keeps on evolving is important. But if you don't have a benchmark to sort of say, okay, but where are we in 2030? Well, then how are the suppliers gonna trust and invest in their supply chain to deliver products that require innovation, that require some sort of transition from what they're used to doing? And that's at least one issue that the taxonomy hasn't been addressing so far yet. Is, you know, here's a set of requirements, they are valid now. In a few years we'll change them, or we'll update them, we'll make them stricter. But in which way are we moving? What are the main problems that are supposed to be addressed in this, as you also mentioned? And it's a complex, but it's a framework, but it's also what are we looking at right now? And it's hard for the market to address these issues.
Yeah, I'd like to, Rosa, did you want to come in on that, or?
Yeah, I'd actually think that I'd very much agree with Jonathan and Anja, and I think that it's also really, if you look at the taxonomy, and I think also that the main objectives that we just mentioned, I think it is also important to understand what is really the objective, right? Because you indicated it's there to create a common language, but it is also currently not the idea that we have to achieve a certain percentage of taxonomy alignment, or it's also not obligatory for companies yet to have a certain amount of taxonomy aligned activities, because it's only one way to measure to measure sustainability, and I don't think it represents the full picture. And I also don't think that it's that the European Commission is indicating that outside of the EU taxonomy there is no other sustainable activities. So I think it's also really important to understand how the taxonomy should be applied, also from a financial market perspective. If we stare blindly only on the EU taxonomy, we miss out on the full relevant scope of sustainable companies, sustainable projects that are, maybe because they don't meet specific criteria, are missed out upon. And I think that would be a crucial mistake. And I also think that, at least from our perspective, that is not how we look at the taxonomy. We see it as part of the sustainability picture, but it doesn't provide us the full overview. And I think in that respect, it's also really important to maintain a dialogue and to have an open conversation about what does it mean to be a sustainable company, what are the transition plans that are in place, and how is the fuller spectrum of that applicable. And I think that's also very relevant because the taxonomy is only limited to a number of counterparties. Today, only, of course, large NFD companies are obliged to report. So also banks are only allowed to include those big companies. But we have a lot of SMEs who really don't have wide sustainability teams to kind of dedicate full amounts of people to go through these really technical screening criteria. But like Anja said, they do have great initiatives. So I think in that respect, it's really important to get on board with each other to talk about what is sustainability, not just from a taxonomy perspective, but also in a broader perspective. And how can we actually make sure that we finance that transition? And the taxonomy can help with that, but it's definitely not the only tool that we have in our toolbox.
Having reflected now on the complexity and having reflected on existing challenges regarding practical implementation and rollout of the circular economy criteria, and the lack of certain support mechanisms and tools, and how likely, judged from today, how likely do you think is your organization to actually report against the taxonomy, the circular economy taxonomy criteria once the delegated act has been adopted? And at the moment it's not very clear when that's going to happen. My personal guess would be that probably as of January 2024. So it was meant to be this January, but of course there's been a delay. There's now a new sustainable finance platform in place, and I think they'll probably pick up the dossier and it's also with the Commission. So so how likely are you, from today's point of view, to report against the criteria as they currently stand?
So as I said in the beginning, we have investors who really ask for an EU taxonomy aligned product, which is the buildings that we build. And so far, this is often a request without them actually having a clear process in place. So we haven't seen EU taxonomy aligned due diligence lists yet, but I'm 100% sure that they will come, especially for investors who invest across Europe, who with the EU taxonomy have a baseline across Europe. That is very handy for them to compare our projects in Germany to the Netherlands to other countries. So we see that really coming through investor due diligence first, and at some point, of course, we will be required to report as well under the CSRD. So very likely.
How about the other two panelists? Circular economy, or at the moment you haven't got much choice because they haven't been adopted, but if they were adopted today, in the current state, in the current status, if you have
I think in the current state, I think we would probably, in order to ensure taxonomy aligned products, would look at the mitigation requirements for significant contribution, because they would be in that sense easier to fulfill. That said, I think the fact that that the taxonomy gives us pointers to what it is that we need to report on. Okay, so investors will be looking at these requirements, and even if we are not able to align with all the aspects of the circular economy criteria, we would probably have to report on, well, how much reuse, how much recycling, how much upcycling, etc. is a part of our building, and that's a snowballing effect. We will start to report on it, we'll start to focus on it, and then we'll start to develop ambitions, and then we'll start adopting them. I think that's that's probably a very pragmatic way for us to work with them. But the mitigation requirements is something that we are working hard towards and finding ways to adopt.
Rosa, from a bank's perspective, do you think the bank might eventually do also reporting against circular economy criteria, or is it more likely to be like with Jonathan that you know, the bank would stick with the mitigation criteria, because you already said that, you know, there are already standards, people are a bit more aware, people are a bit more knowledgeable about it, and of course, you know, climate change, there is also a lot of legislation already in place, so there's a certain amount of familiarity. So
yeah, it's definitely a risk that I see, Ursula, and I think what is also really difficult is, as a bank, we're very much dependent on what our clients are doing, right? So indeed, our clients have to determine the taxonomy alignment. So in that respect, they also have to determine, okay, is it substantial contribution on mitigation or a circular economy? And I think if you look at the requirements from the regulations perspective, specifically for banks, I think what is making matters worse is that we're actually not allowed to double count environmental objectives within our reporting. So that actually means that if we have a project finance with a specific purpose, like a specific project, we actually have to choose the environmental objective which is most relevant. We're not allowed to report both. So in that respect, I think they're also kind of competing with each other. So if we would have a client and it's already reporting on climate change mitigation, for us as a bank, you could say from a pure taxonomy green asset ratio perspective, there is no incentive to kind of also vouch for, you know, let's also look at circular economy, or let's also look at biodiversity to kind of create the scope of the substantial contribution part. So I think in that respect, the taxonomy, the regulation, the way it's built, it's really steering more towards the achievement of one environmental objective. While I think if you look at climate change, we all know it's kind of a holistic approach, and you would also like to see other environmental objectives to be stimulated. Of course, we have to do not significant harm. So you see that there is a minimum bar. But I think we also discussed that even in that minimum bar, you would say that it doesn't really stimulate circular economy objectives that much. So I would definitely see a risk that because climate change mitigation might be easier to adopt and easier to demonstrate, it kind of overshadows the room for circular economy activities, especially because it's implemented first. But of course, we have also a lot of clients that are focusing on circular economy. So maybe within 5 years, or when the market is really developing, we might actually see that more companies will actually focus on circular economy. And of course, in that way, we would love to include those in our report. But I think it has to see how the market will develop in that respect.
yeah, I think that's a very good. This is a very good point where to end the panel discussion and open it up to the audience. I think it'd be interesting to see, once all of the other taxonomies have been developed, also on biodiversity and ecosystems, how they are all going to be relating to one another. And you know, already Sima was showing a kind of like a podium with ranking, you know, like. And the circular economy came in third, but again, it is, and I hate to say it, and yeah, it is still quite a complex. It's a very complex topic in terms of doing it on the ground, yeah, in practical terms. But I think you're absolutely right, Rosa. You know, if we were to come together in 5 years' time, things might be completely different. Yeah, but at the moment, there is probably a tendency to do a little bit of cherry pick. Once the criteria have been adopted, there might be a little bit of cherry picking going on, simply because people are more in their comfort zone with climate issues than there are with circular economy. You know, despite the fact that this is all linked, yeah, it's all linked, as we've seen also with the embodied carbon and, you know, linkages between climate change and biodiversity. So we should really not be looking at these things in silos, and we certainly should not be creating taxonomy silos. So with this, I'd like to open up the floor to the audience. So if you have some specific, I know that there have been a lot of questions coming in, and some of the questions I think Sima may have already endeavored to answer. So I would like now to invite you to ask specific questions either to one of the panelists or maybe even to all of them. Just put your questions in the chat. Well, here's one question which I came across is, should the construction process, I think it's from somebody from Latvia, should the construction process not become more agile through digitization, which would also help with applying circular economy principles? Jonathan, would that be something that how far are you on digitization in Denmark?
Well, I definitely cannot speak for all parts of the construction sector when it comes to digitalization, because I think we're in some matters we're quite far with having digital models of our projects, both 3D models, but also sort of like very specific models that we use to understand what materials go where, which we use as a baseline for life cycle assessments. So in terms of understanding what type of materials goes into our buildings, I think we're quite far. An issue is, of course, mapping that towards materials that exist in the real world. What are their life cycle impact? What alternatives are there? Again, with this whole focus on CO2 emissions and life cycle emissions is somehow fairly new still, and it's quite expensive to get an EPD for your products, and before all products have this, it's very difficult to sort of map and say, okay, one-to-one, what is the best environmental footprint or circular economy footprint for our product. But I would say we are quite far when it comes to digitalization, but it's still something that needs to be developed further, for sure.
There's also another question linked to that. How are we doing in terms of the availability of salvaged building materials? Because this is, again, looking at the more practical aspect. And can the panel say something about opportunities for this in their specific countries? Are there databases for these products? And should this maybe not be something that the EU could help in developing?
Yeah, well, it's just we have there's a project in Denmark called Circular Bank, I think it's called, that's focusing on exactly that, creating a database for products for reuse or for recycling. How far they are exactly, I honestly have to say I'm not quite sure. They've been working on it for at least a year now, a year or two. But it's also an extremely complex matter and a very complex problem to solve. And there's also, I think, as we've already discussed, there's some issues also with this. What's the best? Should we map all the materials that we can put into other buildings, or should we map all the buildings that we can make better? The most sustainable building is the one we don't use, or the one we don't build, but the one that we reuse. And there's some market dynamics there that work against each other. But we have a project in Denmark, at least, where we're working on it. We're not involved, but there's some really good initiatives and market participants who are working on it.
Yeah, I think we're seeing those platforms also popping up in other countries. What we're seeing at the moment is that those often come from startup initiatives. So again, ground up companies who see this, who want to change something. But at the moment, there are multiple of those building material platforms at the same time, and I think they will, at some point, they will evolve a couple of big ones so that you don't have to go to 15 different websites or 15 different platforms to check for your materials. And they really try to solve that issue that Jonathan mentioned between when will the supply become ready? So when will a building be demolished or slightly partly demolished and material become free, and when will I need it? And if there's too much time in between, you need to figure out, do I store the material? Who takes care of the material? Ideally, you would want to demolish it or disassemble it, and then right away the next day transport it to the other location and build it there. And that is something that really a lot of startups are working on. Concular is a very big one in Germany at the moment. So luckily, we're seeing the type of eBay platforms appear for building materials, and that will be, of course, will become better and more mature in the future, that you can really handle the supply and demand timing.
Again, it's a question of time. Yeah? If there's demand, these things will they will spread, and they will gain in importance, and also maybe get some funding. And I think there's a question here for you, Rosa. Would the bank require taxonomy-related documentation for loans for SMEs in the construction sector?
Yeah, I think what you see in terms of requirements is that for the EU taxonomy, we're currently only allowed to look at N3D companies in terms of reporting. But if you look at a broader regulation in terms of what banks have to report also to our supervisor, you see that there is also this voluntary disclosure on non-N3D companies. So that is actually focusing on SMEs. And you see that a lot of banks are now thinking about, okay, how can we, so in that case, voluntary report also on those SME companies. And I think it is specifically relevant because not only for ABN AMRO, but it's a really large portfolio for us. SMEs, we finance a lot of SME companies, but you also see that a lot of the sustainable activities are actually within those smaller companies, like Anja also just mentioned. So I think it is definitely interesting to have the conversation, but I don't see on the short term that we will require that for a loan. I think it's just a matter of having insight and being able to determine that taxonomy alignment would be interesting. But like I said before, it's not really it's really difficult for a bank to require information that companies themselves are not required to report. And I think what is also really important as a bank is that we also have a big fear of overburdening our clients. We know that when we speak with SMEs, they often have a lot of work trying to run their company, and they don't have large sustainability teams to kind of just give us all the data that we want. So I think that is really a trade-off between having a dialogue, being able to gather information about sustainability performance, while at the same time being able to keep it manageable and not to overburden clients, especially when they are smaller. So I wouldn't foresee that it would be a requirement on the short term. Definitely not. Also not from a regulatory perspective.
Coming back to the materials, and I think we may just be able to do one or two more questions before I hand over to Bruno Sauer from the Spanish Green Building Council, is the aspect of trustworthiness and health and safety of materials. How can we ensure that the recycled and reused materials are actually fit for purpose? I mean, have you got any experience with that, Jonathan or Anja?
We do see that the issue of reusing materials and the trustworthiness is sometimes being questioned from a structural perspective or from an image perspective. So that on a structural perspective, of course, there are still regulations that limit the reuse of materials because you cannot test in the way you can test new materials. And from an image perspective, we have seen in the past that there were people, parties who bought a project from us who said, well, if I want the shiny new headquarter, why would I have like old materials in there? Luckily, we see this changing, so this mindset changing. But again, for some type of materials or building elements, it's quite hard to reuse them from a regulatory perspective. However, we had projects where, for instance, we redeveloped an office building which was I think about 25 years old, and it had a steel beam as an atrium roof that were still totally fine because steel beams have a longer lifespan than 25 years, luckily. So we could reuse them actually, not in one of our projects, unfortunately, but in another project in the Netherlands. So we could dismantle the steel beams, transport them across the Netherlands, and they could become the roof construction of a new building. And so we see that happening more and more, but it requires a party who buys them and who's totally fine having old or existing materials. We require the logistics, we require the right timing. But if it happens, I think it's a great example, and it then shows that you can do it, and it stimulates that the other parties who did it with us will also tell that as a case study, like I tell it right now, and that with that we multiply the effect, the positive effect that such moments can have. And again, steel beams are of course a very easy building component because they're usually square and can be tested quite well on their longevity, but there are other building components which are harder to reuse. So that is our experience in practice.
Thank you very much for the really engaging and interesting discussion, and for providing your insights with regard to the proposed circular economy criteria, and from your own very different perspectives. It's been really interesting, and I hope that the audience also enjoyed the webinar as much as I did. And with this, I'd like to hand the baton to Bruno. My apologies that we couldn't address all of the questions, but we simply haven't got enough time. I'll let Bruno summarize. It's a bit of a challenge to summarize the discussions and the key points. Bruno, over to you.
Thank you, Ursula. Thanks for giving this difficult task to wrap up in 3 or 4 minutes, something we've been working on for already 2 or 3 years, let's say. I have 3 points to mention in this wrap up, in this kind of conclusion. First of all, making reference to the recommendations and the conclusions of our report. In general terms, I mean, we're saying a little bit the same as what we concluded in the previous first report that we did 2 years ago. There's a big problem of data collection. There's a certain problem, next step on defining methodologies, just to not make the market nervous on how do you have to report. It is a fact that buildings or projects which are certified, they have it easier to give in this information. It's true that we should focus a little more, or that the European Taxonomy Commission should focus much more or make it easy for renovation projects than for new buildings. And these are general conclusions. What I learned as a second element from the wrap-up, what I learned from this conversation with the market participants, with the stakeholders, and then I was a little bit surprised, or maybe not, because we have seen it already for many months in the last 2 years. It seems that taxonomy is still not a pain. It is still not a big problem that should be solved. We are still speaking in terms of it's interesting. We would like to learn. We would like to know. It's now how sharing. So in that sense, I think as long as there's not really a pain, there will be no demand, or vice versa. If there's no demand, there will be no pain. I was a little bit surprised listening to the bank sector saying that as long as our client is not really asking for, we're not going to push it. Maybe I'm saying it too strictly, but somewhere it came to that. Maybe the bank sector should say, because this is a financing context or instrument, maybe the bank should say, it is our pain. We would like to see this really implemented, and we want to make it a certain kind of obligation to our clients. It's turning the coin around. In that sense, that's a second conclusion that I think that there's not yet enough feeling of obligation and need in the market to fulfill it. We're still in a moment of trying out. And then the third element, a little based on it is still a moment of learning. It is true, and it's nice to see that from CPEA on, we are able to activate real estate stakeholders to participate in the process. It's a process which came from somewhere a political vision to have European 2050 as a climate neutral continent. And little by little, we see appearing instruments coming from Europe to push this and to help this fastening up. And it's nice to be a part of the process. Now, if it is a process, then we need maybe roadmaps on how to implement and how to be aligned with the taxonomy. Instead of just looking to a certification as a final document, maybe we need some kind of instrument that is helping people and entities and enterprises to fulfill maybe on a longer term. And then I would like to finish with one of the comments that was said that at the end, the taxonomy, what I see from 2 years ago and what's happening now, we start seeing a taxonomy as an instrument of transformation. Maybe 2 years ago it was maybe absurd, or we were looking to taxonomy as a new obligation. I think now you start understanding that the Commission or that Europe has a certain kind of instrument, a lever to transform step by step, year after year. What's our market? First of all, they define certain kind of goals, the 6 ones. And they can increase them, so becoming much more complete and sustainable thinking. On the second level, they have these 2 levels of significant contribution and do not significant harm. And now that we see circular economies also starting having their significant contribution, you see that there we have a certain kind of instrument to play and to push. Suddenly the circular economy significant contribution criteria, they start pushing maybe the mitigation contribution of the taxonomy. So that's something that they start playing internally into the instrument, which is very interesting. And I think then the third element, which was also mentioned in the roundtable discussion, and that's a fact, we on a certain moment we will need benchmarks, we will need values that create certain kind of reference, both for the financial sector saying if you're under this benchmark, I have a problem with financing your product, but also for the regulation world. Europe can start saying as long as you have no 60%, or for every criteria, if you don't fulfill these, we will have a problem. And then you start having a very interesting connection to the other big framework of Europe, which is levels, which is more a framework looking to the regulation of the building sector. And I think on a certain moment, these 2 frameworks, the taxonomy levels, they will completely be complementary. So as a final conclusion, I'm happy to see that this is going faster. I'm happy to see that there are market participants and stakeholders who are willing to be participants in this process. And as a CPEA entity, I think we have the obligation to keep on pushing it. I suppose in the coming months and years, we will enter with other items like the ecosystems, the biodiversity, the social aspects. And I only can invite everybody who's listening to this presentation that just if you want to become a member of CPEA and push it harder and be part of these reports, because we need your knowledge and we need entities who are willing to push to the European Commission more maybe realistic instruments. But it's a vice versa. It's a process that goes and back from the market to the policy world, etc., etc. Ursula, with this I finish the wrap up. Everybody's invited to keep on working together with us, and I give you the last words for closing this seminar.
Well, thank you for those concluding words, Bruno. Very well said and very well summarized, and I do appreciate the challenge of doing this in a very, very short time. I'd like to thank Bruno, I'd like to thank the panelists, the audience, and Christina, but above all, I'd like to thank Sima from the DGNB for steering everybody through this project, preparing the slides, and sharing her insights with us today. And with this, I'd like to close the webinar. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you.